Welcome to the Predictable Revenue Podcast, where sales leaders teach you what's working for them so you can build it yourself.
This episode of the Predictable Revenue Podcast is brought to you by our sales coaching and consulting services. Are you looking to create repeatable, scalable, and predictable revenue? We've helped thousands of companies grow their business with tailored expert advice backed by testing to ensure they establish the best practices that will work for them. Head over to bit.ly/predictable coaching to learn more.
Matt, welcome to the podcast. I'm excited to have you here.
Thank you for having me, Colin. I'm excited for this conversation.
This has been an interesting theme the last couple episodes. I've had some founders on. We've got some more founders coming on. We've been talking a little bit about founder-led sales. And the reason why I thought this conversation was so interesting and fit into this kind of arc that we're doing was that you held on to the AE role for so long. I think you're 6 years in, you said, and you're just hiring your first AE.
Yeah. We brought on board our first AE actually earlier this year, and to be fully transparent, I'm still a big part of my focus, how I spend my time day to day, is still in that frontline sales role. So it's like 1.5 AEs, if you want to call it that, here at Sales Assembly. So even 6, almost 7 years into the game, haven't been able to let go of that seller role.
I love it. So for those listening going, well, how is this relevant if I'm an AE or a sales leader? Well, the things we're going to talk about are why Matt hung on to the AE role for so long, how he kind of determines and works out the math on how fast he needed to grow. We're gonna take a detour and talking about BDRs. And then we're going to land the conversation talking about sort of the difference between maybe a specialized sales organization with BDRs, account managers, and account executives versus a more traditional full cycle relationship manager role that Matt and I probably both grew up selling in models like that. And so it's going to start with kind of a bit of the history of Sales Assembly. And if you're like, why should I listen to Matt? He runs a pretty impressive company called Sales Assembly, where they help some of the world's best companies figure out, train their AEs, SDRs, account managers. And so he's got a wide breadth of experience that he's bringing into this conversation. And I thought it was a really interesting dichotomy of, working with some of the world's fastest growing venture-backed startups, than to have this bootstrapped entrepreneur who's still hanging onto the AE role. So I've been really looking forward to this conversation personally. That's what we're going to cover. Matt, I'd love to kind of segue into this. Let's talk about what you're doing now, or let's talk about why you hung on to the AE role for so long in the first place.
Yeah, it's an interesting question, and a lot of it, again, just in the sake of transparency, boiled down to necessity. You spoke to it a moment ago. While we work with predominantly these really fast-growing, in many cases, venture-backed B2B software companies, Sales Assembly, we've always been a bootstrap company, just building slowly from the ground up. So a byproduct of that is just myself, and to a limited extent, my partner, Jeff, as founders, as co-founders. We needed to be that frontline sales organization. And even though we continued to scale to a point where we did have interest in outside investors, and still do have interest to this day from outside investors, because we run, a healthy, profitable business, which, as you could imagine in this day and age, is kind of a rarity. We still elected not to take any outside capital. So a lot of it has been, number one, I do enjoy it. I think it's effective. There's very few things that I do halfway decently. This is one of them. So I might as well try to continue leaning into that to make myself useful. But also just a byproduct of not having, the quote unquote traditional runway that most of the types of companies that operate in this ecosystem might have, where we can go out and build a true sales organization and see how that works in A/B tests in real time. Because with us, every month, being a bootstrap company that's cash in, cash out, we need to make sure that we're bringing in more revenue than we're spending in payroll and expenses, all that kind of stuff. So again, it kind of comes with the territory of building the business the way that we have.
Love it. And you don't have, I want to jump to the BDRs, but I'm curious, you've gotten to the point where you've hired an AE. It sounds like you're growing the marketing team just a little bit. Talk to me about the decision process there, and where deals have come from in the past and what the plan is for the future.
Yeah, so where deals have come from in the past, and to an extent still come from to this day, is through relationships. And that is the benefit of having a very specific ICP. Our niche by and large is going to be, again, growth stage B2B software companies. And the ICP that we sell into is going to be predominantly the VP of sales or chief revenue officer, and, to an extent, maybe director, VP level enablement leaders. Now, when you think about that demographic, you think about the demographic of a VP of sales or chief revenue officer of a fast-growing B2B tech company. A lot of these folks tend to know each other, right? Why do they know each other? Because they spent their previous years at companies like Salesforce or LinkedIn or Oracle, whatever the case may be. So there's like this really cool network of these folks that all tend to know each other to an extent, like keep in touch with each other. So we found that our most effective sales motion, again, just given the product that we sell and who we sell it to, was always to leverage relationships in some way, shape, or form. Now, to your other question, why did we start building out the marketing team and the sales team relatively recently? It's because over the past 5 years, and especially since 2020, after COVID hit, and we had to fundamentally redesign what our business was, what we did, and how we did it. We spent about 2 years getting to the point where it's like, great, we have this proverbial fire that is already built, right? We know the fire has been built. We know it's sustainable. Now is the time where it makes sense again for us, a profitable bootstrapped company, to start investing in gasoline to pour on that proverbial fire. And that's what caused us to say, now's the right time to start investing in sales competencies on the sales front, as far as additional headcount, but also leadership on the marketing front.
I love that. And I don't want to go too deep into, I don't want to make this, an ad for Sales Assembly, but I am curious about the model. What did it look like before? What does it look like now? Talk to me about that 2-year journey.
Yeah, so the similarities between 2017 and 2023 is that it is an annual membership at a company level. So a company like G2 or Sprout Social or Outreach will get involved in Sales Assembly. The biggest difference between 2017 and 2023 is prior to COVID, we only did business with companies that had a physical presence here in Chicago because everything that we did was always in person, right? And as you can imagine, nothing like a global pandemic to kind of change your business strategy a little bit. So we moved everything to virtual in 2020, and that gave us the opportunity to expand what we did, which was skill development for go-to-market teams and community for the go-to-market professionals, both leaders and contributors. It gave us the opportunity to expand that across North America and Canada.
I love that. Very interesting. Almost a blessing in disguise.
Yeah, I would tell people all the time, I hate to admit it. It does sound like a terrible thing to say, but the silver lining, COVID was probably one of the best things to happen to Sales Assembly. We were a nice business before. My partner, Jeff, maybe 2 to 3 W-2 employees working with around, 75 to 80 logos here in Chicago. And you fast forward a couple of years, just prompted by the pandemic and everything that resulted as far as, the logistical challenges and requirements that we had to make, the pivots that we had to make in order to remain viable as a business, ended up helping us become much more successful. Now we have a team of around 14 and work with a couple hundred B2B software companies.
That's amazing. I love that. And probably helps that everybody else's sales team went remote as well. Because I do recall like selling sales consulting 5 years ago, everybody, you got to be in person. How can you do sales consulting remotely? It's like, well, Zoom.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So we did have the proverbial winds at our back for a significant period of time there.
Love it. And so you haven't used BDRs in the past. Let's kind of pivot the conversation and talk to me about why no BDRs when you're the company that trains BDRs?
Yeah, it is admittedly pretty ironic. And it goes back to our overall sales philosophy. And again, that's a fancy way of just looking at what has worked for us historically and not being willing to take on an inordinate level of risk to start trying different things. Again, going back to, again, the type of business that we are and how we're building it. We had proven both pre-COVID and post-COVID that building a sales organization around a relationship-based type of sale was scalable for us and was going to continue to be successful for us. To an extent, we're able to pretty accurately forecast around it, even though it sounds weird to be able to forecast, a number of referrals that you might receive. I know that's, that might be tough for other organizations to do. For us internally, we were able to sort of dial that in, right? So that's something that we could plan around. And even when we went out and started building our sales team and building our marketing team, if you take a look at what we're doing internally and how we're continuing to sort of pour gasoline on that fire that I mentioned a few moments ago, it is still all revolving around a relationship-based sale, a community-led approach, which again, just by pure coincidence, as we see right now across the ecosystem, we see a whole lot of B2B tech companies that are taking a look at this type of approach, leveraging their customers and advocates in order to gain new customers and advocates as the best path to attain new logos and maybe also identify expansion revenue within their existing client base.
That's really interesting, because I think an interesting perspective that you have is with so much access to all of these companies. I'm curious what you have seen, what you've seen, heard that's changed in sales in the last kind of 6 to 12 months.
Yeah, there's been a lot that has changed, and that will be an understatement. And for context, for those who are listening, is one of the things that we do here is every month we have a standing Zoom call, what we call a peer group call, for the VPs of sales and the CROs of all the companies that we work with. So on a monthly basis, the whole point of that call is just for these leaders to come together, raise their hands in a group full of their peers and say, hey, here's what I'm working on, here's what I'm struggling with, are you seeing this, that, or the other thing? And it gives them the opportunity to exchange ideas and best practices in real time. The benefit that gives to us, as you alluded to, Colin, is we do kind of have this bird's eye view of like, hey, what are all these B2B software companies doing right now? What are the trends that we're seeing across the market? And what we saw beginning in Q3 of last year, obviously, as the economy shifted, you fast forward to Q1 of this year, things started getting a little bit better. Then it's like, oh, hey, why not throw a bank run, into the environment just to mess with everybody's day? We're seeing a lot of uncertainty around the viability of BDR teams, or just cold outreach in general, right? And from our perspective, that seems to be driven by two factors. Number one, again, economic environment. It's getting much tougher just to get people on the phones or interested in having a conversation with you in general because budgets are tight. But number two, with the rise of AI and ChatGPT, now every organization, regardless what you sell or who you sell into, every organization has some sort of equivalent of a BDR team that could just crank out, halfway decent messaging and distribute that messaging at scale. So the space itself, regardless, again, of the vertical or industry that you sell into, it's gotten really noisy, right? So you see a lot of leaders that are trying to figure out right now, like, okay, how do we cut through the noise? And if we're not convinced that we could cut through this noise, does, the BDR function, does it really make sense for us anymore? And there are no clear answers to that right now, but these are the types of conversations that a lot of leaders across the space are having.
Really appreciate the context. Mind if I weigh in a little bit? Because I've got some thoughts and some questions. Like, I think if we add in the context, this is May 31st, 2023. Like, the last 10 months have been, I think, fair to say, like a strong pullback in the venture investing space. And like people that once raised, $100 million on $1 million in ARR are now in a tough situation where you're looking at a pretty extreme down round. And so I suspect there's a lot of companies, I mean, maybe it's not as extreme as 100 million to $1 million in ARR, but
not far off. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, 80 to 1, anyway. Yeah. So if we look at like what powered the BDR, like the last 12 years has been a pretty strong market, with a couple of blips in the software in this like tech space. And that's really when the BDR model was like heavily popularized. The thing that always blew me away, I always followed David Skok for entrepreneurs.com, and he would do the Pacific Crest survey. I think it's KeyBank now. They do like a cost to acquire or they do a bunch of things, but one of the metrics you would always talk about is cost to acquire $1 of ARR. And when I started looking at it in 2016, it was 92 cents. And I thought, holy shit, that's an extreme amount of money. And in the last number they published, I think was 2021. It might've been, I don't think 2022s are out yet. But it was $1.60. And so if you're a software company and your CAC is a $1.60 to acquire $1, that customer has to stay 3 years just to make a 50% margin, or not even, and that doesn't factor in your servers, your engineers, et cetera. So all these companies that had, you hear, on the podcasts, the companies that have, 90% margins, like, well, in theory, you've got a 90% gross, but your cost to acquire a customer is huge. And I think this is when we saw the SDR boom. I think what we're seeing now is kind of the unwinding of it. And one of the interesting facts, like over the last 12 months, our numbers have gone up like almost every month. And one part of me is like, is it because they're just less BDRs that are banging down the doors now?
Yeah, that number one, I mean, that data is extremely interesting. So thank you for sharing it. Number two, I think that there might be some validity to that. I mean, when you combine, and again, just taking a look at what you do, what your business does, when you combine just the wins that are sort of pushing the ecosystem as a whole in a general direction, combine that with companies looking at increased efficiency and decreasing risk, right? And, an organization like yours, giving them the opportunity to say like, hey, let's not necessarily like add the headcount right now. Let's see if we could find ways to drive revenue while reducing some of this risk that you would normally take on if you had, raised, nice Series B or a Series A and gone out and hired, 10 BDRs or SDRs, let's say. So yeah, now that you mentioned it, does really surprise me that you potentially have seen an uplift in your business over the past couple quarters.
Yeah. Like email, phone, across the board.
Yeah.
Over the last, I'd say 10, 12 months. No, it's coincided with us getting better at some things. We've got some like AI email writing stuff, and we're doing some better jobs with like the account personalization prioritization. There's been some big steps, and we've added power parallel dialers. So like those things help, but I was expecting to see what you were seeing. And when we came into this year, I was like, yeah, this is what I think we'll see. And I've been wrong. So it's been interesting to see the kind of parallels that some companies are seeing this, some companies are not. And maybe there's a filter because the companies that we had as customers carrying into this year that we're starting to see those decreases probably turned away. So maybe there's some like survivorship bias in the data that I'm looking at, that the companies that are with us are the companies that are targeting industries that are doing well or have really strong product market fit.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it could be that. And, to a point that you alluded to a moment ago, it'll be interesting if we could jump into the DeLorean, right? And head just a year in the future and look back and, see like, okay, what really happened during Q1 through Q3 of 2023, how did the ecosystem sort of settle? Did when we look at this as far as like a series of pendulum swings, right? You mentioned it was like, hey, back then, big overinvestment in SDRs, maybe too much, where did the pendulum sort of settle, right? After, we as an ecosystem decided like, okay, well, taking in mind, our CAC and LTV and all these other metrics, here's going to be an appropriate go forward plan in this new economic environment.
Mm-hmm. Totally. I think you're totally right, because the new economic environment, everybody went from growth at all costs. This is what I remember hearing on customer call. Doesn't matter. I'm trying to work out, I'm a bootstrap business as well. I'm trying to work out, okay, is this going to be profitable? And we've got companies that are spending $2,000, their ACV is $2,000. And I'm like, probably shouldn't be spending $8,000 per SDR. That's going to be, I've seen companies make it work. But again, they've made it work on you're investing $1.62 to acquire $1, right? And I think a lot of companies, a lot of sales leaders maybe struggled to understand that, or they weren't incentivized to understand that. They were incentivized for growth at all costs. Like talked to one guy who was their cost to acquire was 5x their ACV.
Yeah. No, I think the question of incentives is right on. I mean, I remember this was September of last year. I was having coffee with the CEO of, what at the time, they had just raised a Series B. So this was just as the economy started really, and the tech ecosystem specifically started taking a turn. And he was telling me, his board meeting in Q1, the board, the investors, their exact words were, "You're not spending money fast enough," right? And then Q2, just 3 months later, same board meeting, same investors, "We need 30 months of runway, like tomorrow," right? So it's not only a question of incentives, but again, going back to just the general sense of the ecosystem as a whole, that was the model, right? Regardless of, who your primary benefactor was, who was funding you, this firm versus that firm, that was the model, right? And again, going back to this analogy of a swinging pendulum, it seems like now it's like, okay, we swung a little bit too far to that side. Now we really have to wait and see, okay, where are we going to settle in the middle?
Mm-hmm. I totally agree. I want to talk a little bit about the sort of, we've talked about the downsides of the BDR motion from a financial perspective. Like, people say, oh, SDRs are dead and AI is killing SDRs. And I don't think that's true at all. I think if anything, AI enrichment is going to help SDRs do more. Mm-hmm. I think to your point, like there are going to be a lot of companies that are moving away from unprofitable sales motions. And that's probably the thing that's killed the most jobs. But I think you could make the argument that those weren't jobs that should have existed in the first place. It was just kind of driven by the funding, the state of funding, and a lot of irrational exuberance, if that's the right word to describe it. But let's assume let's put the finances aside. Let's go back to the BDR motion. There is something transactional about the BDR motion. I'd love to, let's talk about, what are some of the downsides?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I mean, personally, I agree with you. I mean, I'm not a subject matter expert on this, as I'm not on those things, but I would presume that AI, it's not about replacement, it's about augmentation, right? It's just like in other areas of our lives, how's it going to make what we do day to day just a little bit more efficient? And I personally believe that's what's going to happen with BDR teams. But yeah, the downside, going back to a theme that I mentioned before, it's one of those things when everybody's doing it, right? It's really easy for you to get lost in the noise. So how can you separate yourself? How can you make an impression on a potential buyer in a way that's not being tried by 10 other or 20 other or 100 other firms exactly like yours? And, I think that we saw some variation of this maybe about a year or two ago when social selling, the concept of social selling, really started picking up steam. And then eventually you pull up LinkedIn as an example today, where I spend a whole lot of time, it looks like, as much as I hate to say it, a lot of noise, right? Because it's, BDRs and, full cycle AEs that hundreds of different companies that sell into, hundreds of different verticals that are all doing some variation of the same thing, right? I think that is a good microcosm for the BDR function in general, and the struggle that it's going to constantly run into, right? Even if we get to a point where, as you and I presume, AI is just augmenting a BDR and SDR team to be more efficient in their roles, it's probably only going to take maybe a year or two before it's like, okay, well, every firm now operates in this way. So it's always this game of like, okay, what can we do to stay one step ahead of the competition, so to speak? And, when we talk about one step ahead, that is defined just getting somebody's attention, right? In an environment where, attention is critical, and it's easy for potential buyers to get distracted because everybody just looks like you.
Oh, 100%. And one thing I found with the So like we got two motions. We have an inbound and an outbound motion. And I remember a prospect in the very early days. I think our AE was out of town, and I'm the same as you. AE selling is my trade. And as a CEO, as a new CEO, you're good at selling and you're not good at much else for a while, maybe for a long while. Who's to say? But I definitely see it as being one of my stronger suits. And so I remember a time in a conversation with a prospect, and they got on the phone with me, and they should have been excited. They inbounded to me. They were a right fit. They had pain. They were frustrated. I was like, tell me about this. Well, I talked to so-and-so or I filled out a form, and then I went back and forth with Tristan, and then I had a really good chat with Tristan. And then, Tristan passed you his notes, but now I've got to restart the conversation and have another conversation with you. I'm like, No, we were, this was kind of a small one example, but there is I think it highlights the fact that when you specialize your sales roles, there is a cost to the customer, right? Of having to transition from, okay, you've had a chat with Tristan, now you get a chat with Colin. And if you develop a strong relationship, now it's like, okay, we got to start fresh. But why can't I finish the conversation with them? And so there's this, and I think that there's two things. There's the impact on the customer, and there's the impact on the rep itself. And I think, if you're specializing, you're focusing them. There are upsides and downsides. And I'm saying this as like a downside, but I still believe in the BDR model. But it forces it sets your BDR's firmware as transactional. I only care about you if there's a project in the next 90 days. And I wonder if there's, something that we're missing in that model.
Yeah, it's, interesting that you say that. The theme that jumps out to me is, really just being the importance of meeting your buyers where they're at. And we all know, because we've all read, the same data, buyers are coming in more educated. They're only talking to a sales rep, once they're 75% or whatever it is of the way towards actually making a buying decision. Understanding that there's variance, depending on the industry and the buyer and all that good stuff. But that is another game of, sort of catch up, as I mentioned before, where it's like, okay, well, not only are the behaviors that we take as sellers, not only do they have to change constantly to accommodate the market and, what is going to resonate most with buyers, what's going to grab their attention, but we also, at the same time, we have to make sure that we're removing as much friction as possible from the buying experience. And, how do you do that, especially if you're operating in an environment that is, anything close to mid-market or an enterprise sale where it's not just transactional, right? It's not just $1,000 to $2,000, ASP types of environments, right? So again, it's another constant moving target that sales teams need to keep an eye on, is meeting the buyers where they're at. But yeah, that one example that you shared, and I know it's just sample size of one example, but it's reminiscent of all the conversations that we as an ecosystem had. God, this was 3 or 4 years ago, about the handoff between sales and customer success, right? How do we need to make sure that we remove as much friction as possible from that experience to create, a really great customer journey. But yeah, again, long-winded way of saying it's just another moving target that sales teams have to be mindful of.
Totally. And there was for mine, there was a very easy solution, which was we just stopped having our BDR take the first call. And instead the BDR's function was to book the first meeting with the AE. Very simple problem. I wanted to have the conversation to highlight that there's no right or wrong answer. There are trade-offs on both sides of the equation, right? There are strong benefits for specialization, right? And I think the bull case for specialization is if you have really strong closers, mathematically, it works out better if you have a closer who's got a 40% closing rate and a closer that has a 20% closing rate. If you can take that 20% closer, make them a BDR, or remove them and find a BDR at the same rate to book meetings for that 40% closer, your net of what you achieve out of your pipeline is going to be more efficient. The bull or the bear case for sales development or specialization is, to your point on, the handoff between AE to account manager or AE to CS, and a piece I've been hearing lately is that, people are asking if you're selling more to your existing customers, you're going to a customer success team that these individuals I'm generalizing based on what I've heard from my experience. The people that I know who transitioned or have gone into customer success, they went in because they didn't want to carry a quota. They went in because they wanted to serve customers and they didn't want to sell. Whereas before we called it account management. Back in my day, and I had to dial on my phone.
Yeah. And you walked uphill to school, in the snow both ways, right?
In my grandfather's pajamas.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so I think there's like the upside of a full cycle model is that it's one consistent experience, right? You talk, the AE prospects, the AE closes you have your Matt, Matt's your guy, and it's a consistent process. The hard thing about that model is, from my experience, and this is myself actually as a seller, I was okay at prospecting. I was very good at closing. And then what would happen is I'd spend, a year and a half at a company. I'd be at I'd have $1 million in, a recurring revenue under my belt, maybe $1.5 million, and I'm hitting my quota just servicing these customers. Now, does it make sense to spend that much on an account manager, or could somebody, and account management, the small details, anybody who knows me is like, yes, this is so true. The small details are not my specialty. And that's kind of what you need for an account manager. So the downside of me being an account manager was small details. I needed support on that. The upside was the customers, I had a really strong relationship with them, even if I was kind of clumsy on some of the details side. So I'm curious your take on the upside downside. What do you disagree with? What have I missed?
No, I agree with all that. And it's nice to meet a fellow traveler. Anyone who knows me will probably say the exact same things about me. It's like, hey, Matt, God's, sure, he might be able to close a deal every now and again, but oh my God, don't put him in front of a spreadsheet because details aren't really his thing. But yeah, to your larger point, that's indicative. And again, not to turn this back to sales assembly and what we do, because that's not the point of this conversation. But, we were looking at some really interesting data throughout 2022. We provide skill development training for the entire go-to-market team, sales and post-sales. We had more CSMs and account managers involved in sales-focused training than we did actual salespeople. And we had a whole lot of salespeople involved. What is the reason for that? To your point before, because the teams are looking at, the leaders are looking at their teams and saying hey, wow, the people that are built in a detailed oriented fashion like you and I are not, that's not stuff that can be taught, I don't think. That's just hey, you're just inclined to be good at, being very detail oriented. But, educating your team on some of the tactics, how do you better identify expansion opportunities? What are some strategies that you can employ when an existing customer is ghosting you? What are those email outreach templates look like? Small things like that salespeople like you and I, it's that's 101 kind of stuff. We see a lot of investments being made into upskilling the post-sales teams on these competencies for that exact reason. They know that there is this literal gold mine that exists within the existing client base. They don't want to take really great salespeople, great closers like yourself, and have them be account managers. So okay, how do we solve for that? Let's find a way to turn our post-sales teams into what look like salespeople at the end of the day. So we do see a lot of companies that have been making those moves over the past 12 to 18 months specifically.
I think it makes a ton of sense. For the companies that are making it through and still growing, they've got a strong base of happy customers, right?
Yeah.
I think that's anybody who's still alive, congratulations, your customers love you, right? Because the last 12 months have probably been pretty hard for everybody with less and less and less budget. I wonder, trending back to the full cycle rep, full cycle AE, is that a good thing? Is it a bad thing? Does it depend?
Yeah, I think, like everything in life, I think that there's going to be shades of gray built in there. So short answer is it depends. But again, looking at the trends in the market, we see a lot of companies that used to have, very clearly segmented or specialized teams. They are making a pivot to full cycle right now. I mean, for, many of the reasons that we've been talking about on this call, really to streamline that buying experience, and saying like, hey, why don't we make sure that our closers are actually building and generating and managing their own pipeline as well? And then, taking that a step further, it's like, okay, well, how do we prepare if the larger point and the goal is to make an impression, is to gain a prospect's attention? Now we're turning these people to full cycle sellers. How do we differentiate ourselves? That's where we also see a lot of companies that are making investments into preparing their teams to do more things in person, right? Even when budgets are constrained right now, because again, it's like, great, how do we separate ourselves? Let's get away from 30-minute Zoom increments. Let's find, if we really want to talk about meeting buyers where they're at, let's take that in the most literal definition of the term and say like, hey, you are going to be at this trade show. Let's make sure that we take you and some folks that look like you out to dinner, out to happy hour, so on and so forth. So you can make that human to human connection. And that is really going to be your differentiator compared to your competitors.
I'm struck by the fact that I think we're similar era kind of sales experience.
Yeah.
If we assume that, a lot of AEs, might be listening, have grown up in an era of specialization, I wonder if we could talk a little bit about what kind of good relationship or full cycle selling looks like. Like, I remember my initial training was like, I had Mike, and Mike's like, get a Rolodex. And he literally meant like a Rolodex. And he's like, you got to know everybody's birthday, anniversary, et cetera, et cetera. Like, what does, and I'm not suggesting people actually go buy a physical Rolodex, but I'm curious, what is your take on what does it mean to be a good relationship seller?
You spoke to it, with that comment before about the Rolodex. I mean, that is no joke, something that I've done for years, something that I still do to this day. That's, in my opinion, that's a big part of what a CRM is built for. I mean, you can leverage your existing CRM, HubSpot, whatever it is, if you are in the process, if you're really interested in building relationships and you don't know marital status, do they have a partner? Do they have children? What are their children's names? What's their birthday? What do they do in their spare time? Where, are they passionate about any social causes? Do they volunteer? All these different things that I would think, at least the way I'm built, I'm interested in learning that stuff just on the human to human level. Right. And, just by pure coincidence, in my opinion, that's a natural byproduct towards making you a more effective seller when you're able to pay attention and actually catalog those, what might seem to other people's like minor insignificant details. Again, that, it's the small details like that can make or break a potential sale when you're dealing with another human, right? That is going to respect and admire the fact that you're actually taking a legitimate interest, not feigning an interest, but taking a legitimate interest in who they are as people rather than just potential prospects.
I don't remember the last time I saw marital status in a CRM. Like, as soon as you said that, I was right back into Maximizer. And like, I had Maximizer on my laptop back in the day that I had like a network card I had to shove in the side so I could get Wi-Fi. And I absolutely, I remember birthday, kids, all this stuff. And I think one thing that was maybe lost in the transition from like the installed on your desktop CRM to Salesforce was Maximizer was my tool. I paid whatever it was, $99 for it. I got that version. I owned it. Salesforce is my boss's tool, my company's tool. And I wonder if that's where the like salesperson's relationship with CRM kind of broke down a little bit.
Yeah, I think that that's part of it, but I also think that a big part of it, again, was just the trends of the ecosystem as a whole, where keeping catalog of that stuff became less and less important as the sales motion changed, right? Because if you have a BDR or SDR team that's just going to tee you up with qualified meetings, and you're just going to take those meetings like, great, 2 calls after this, I'm going to close them, I'm going to pass them off to the post-sales team. Who cares how many kids Colin has, right? But, again, a lot of sellers just haven't built that muscle memory, so to speak, where, I know Colin, like, hey, hope you don't mind my sharing this publicly. You have two kids that are both 5 years old, and, you swim, and, they might be doing hockey because you live in Canada and that's in your blood. Like, that is stuff where in HubSpot and, Colin's record, even if there aren't dedicated fields to that, I'm definitely placing the note, right? Just so that the next time we chat, number one, I think it's interesting. I want to be able to continue having conversations with you about it in general. But number two, I do think that in this new sales environment, where again, the larger theme is how do we differentiate ourselves from our competitors? And, a big part of that is connecting with people at a human to human level, just that type of information, and not leveraging is the wrong term, not leveraging it, but being mindful about it and working it into, the human to human conversations that you're having with prospects. Again, it's going to be critical. And I think that's really going to separate high performers with low performers.
I totally agree. I think just to build on your point a little bit, one thing that you mentioned, I was thinking about, the average tenure of an SDR or an AE in an organization over the last couple of years has probably been, my guess for a BDR is probably 12 to 18 months.
Yep.
I imagine pretty similar to an AE.
Yep.
And so if you're in a transactional sales, process, even if it's not like I'm not saying order taker or small volume. I just mean, as a closer, you're just closing. As an account manager, you're just managing accounts. If you're a closer, if you're a BDR, there's no value in taking these notes because you're here for 18 months, then you're gone and you're working with a totally new set of buyers. Right. And I think if people are, I've heard people say, oh, sales is, being dehumanized. And I wonder if this is one of the kind of elements that's leading to it.
Yeah, it's interesting that you said, I never thought about it that way. My gut is that I'd be inclined to agree just as far as like the dehumanization component and how what we collectively have done as salespeople, as sales organizations in this ecosystem specifically, have done to sort of foster that. But yeah, it is interesting, and it'll be interesting to see again the sea change that we're going through right now. Sales professionals that haven't valued these types of competencies or these types of skill sets over the past few years, how they're going to fare over the next few years when, again, I believe just like I believe, I might be wrong, I believe AI is going to make us much more efficient rather than replace us. I also believe, but I might be wrong, that these types of competencies, again, just building authentic relationships at a human level, are going to become more and more important.
I totally agree. I think the AI, the enrichment, I think the tech and tools to get more efficient, are prevalent. I think now, given that, we are out of this growth at all cost mindset, people are actually going to start focusing on, okay, let's pay off some of the process backlog or technical debt in our process so that our reps can prospect more efficiently, so that our reps can do all of this. It's been honest. I think the last 3 months, it's been one of the biggest trends that I've seen in our pipeline specifically is companies are more caring about what their AEs are doing and how they can support their AEs in prospecting. And a lot of that is taking what we've learned from the BDR perspective and applying it to AEs and applying it to like the data and the processing. And they don't necessarily, I know a lot of sales ops people got, laid off like 10 months ago. So companies have less and less of that. And now their AEs are being asked to do more and more. And as an AE, it's hard to prospect, do your cold call for 90 minutes a day, then go close a bunch of deals and then manage a bunch of accounts. Like there's 3 different jobs you have to be good at.
Yeah. And, for the larger theme that we hear of every day, do more with less. That is proof positive right there as far as what sales professionals are being asked to do these days.
Totally. I'm really enjoying the conversation. I do feel like we could get philosophical and wear funny hats and smoke pipes, talk sales all day. I did want to bring it to a close out of respect for your time. You mentioned in our pre-interview a story about a sales leader coaching reps on how to visit a customer in person. I wonder if you could share.
Yeah, it's, going back to the conversation that we had a moment ago, if you just picture this, I mean, you're a seller that as of today, 2023, May 31st, you have 5 years of experience, right? Now you think back, okay, what does that 5 years look like? To your point before, maybe 2018, 2019, you started as BDR, SDR, 2020 got promoted into an account executive role. What have you known throughout your entire sales career? It's been phone, Zooms, 30-minute increments, just back to back. And what we've seen is, again, as I mentioned, more and more companies sort of prioritizing, great, let's meet people in person. Let's try to differentiate ourselves from our competitors. We heard multiple stories recently of leaders that were encouraging their sales teams to do this and sales teams pushing back with a whole lot of hesitancy. And at first the leaders thought like, okay, is this a work-life balance thing? Do you not want to be on the road? They're trying to diagnose the issue. And what they found, the root of the issue was just an extreme level of anxiety, right? The sales professionals were nervous about getting on the road because they did not feel that they were equipped to have face-to-face interactions with people. They looked at the prospect of like, wait, how, if I'm taking somebody out to coffee or taking a group of people out to happy hour, right, for an hour and a half, how do I do that? Right. How do I hold a conversation? What do we talk about? I mean, like how does this work? So it led to this epiphany within this specific sales leader and a few other sales leaders that we know that were dealing with similar potential roadblocks as far as just the investments that they had to make. And again, old people like you and I that have been in this game for a while, like, again, we could probably take someone out to coffee at a dinner and we could have, meaningful conversation and not get to, it's second nature to us. But if you've legitimately never done that before, it is understandable when you think about it. It's like, okay, well, yeah, we need to make sure that we're equipping our sales teams with the competencies to do this. So the end result was, the leader actually starting to travel with their team, showing them how it's done, leading from the front, right? And also making some requisite investments into more skill-based training around effective storytelling. Improv training has been a big thing that we've seen recently. Again, just being able to pivot and handle, different types of conversations that aren't structured within a 30-minute Zoom time slot. I just thought that when I first heard that a few months ago, it just blew my mind, continues to blow my mind to this day. But when you think about it, extremely valid, right? If you're a 25-year-old or a 27-year-old, 28-year-old that's been in sales for 5 years, this is something that's completely new to you. And leaders do need to be cognizant of that when they are beginning to push their teams to do more stuff in person.
100%. I love the improv. I was like, you think about like, what are the two most awkward things you could possibly do? It's like going in cold to meet with a prospect if you're new into sales and be like, so what do we talk about?
Yeah.
And standing in front of a group being like, okay, so now I got to be funny. Like,
yeah.
Two equal levels of like social anxiety, I think that produces. Because I certainly remember I was thinking back the other day of my first sales job and like the sales conversations I actually had where I was an order taker with a truck at best when I think about the conversations and the progress I was helping those accounts make. I think that was all I can, the only credit I can give myself was maybe I was persistent and I was helpful. But when I was sitting down with those prospects, you're trying to do the relationship thing, but I wasn't doing any of the qualifying. It wasn't, hey, tell me about what your projects are going on. Tell me about this, tell me about that, and trying to dig. And it's a fine balance to figure out how do you, in a social context, weave between, what the prospect is expecting and what the progress you need to make in the sales conversation so you could kind of inch this account a little bit forward. I'm curious, last question for you. If somebody's sitting here listening and they're going, I now have to do this, what advice would you have for them?
I would say, presuming that the question is referring to an individual contributor, a lot of it is just taking ownership, right? Taking ownership of the fact like, okay, well, if I have the amount of self-introspection where I could identify like, hey, I might need some help in this regard, you got to bring that up to your leader, right? Presumably if you have a halfway decent leader, he or she is going to think like, okay, this is what I'm here for, right? This is my opportunity to step in and provide the coaching that you need. But it's really just not being shy, not being ashamed. Again, I think back that, in the example that I laid out, the sales team at the organization, at first they were hesitant to share that they were nervous, right? Because understandably, it could make you feel embarrassed, like, oh God, I don't know how to operate in person. I think just having the level of confidence and self-introspection to A, own up to it, and B, take some level of ownership for improvement, right? Use the learning and development budgets that your company might afford to you, right? To invest in, LinkedIn Live courses or Udemy or improv training or whatever the case may be, that hit on some of these competencies just so that you can be better prepared than any of your competitors.
Love that. Matt, thank you so much for coming on the show. If people are curious about Sales Assembly or they want to get in touch with you, what's the best way for them to reach out?
Yeah, they could always look into us at salesassembly.com. I'm extremely online on LinkedIn, so you can always connect with me. I encourage you to connect with me on LinkedIn. Shoot me a DM there. Would love to keep in touch with anyone who's interested.
Right on. Well, Matt, thank you so much for coming on the show.
No, thank you for having me, Colin. This was great.
I enjoyed it. And thanks to everybody for listening. We'll see you all next week.